Good afternoon. I'm really pleased that we have so many people that have joined us. My name's Derek Ball, as I've just been introduced. I head up the sports science degree programs here at the university. As an ex-athlete, I have an interest in athletic performance. And as a physiologist and a biochemist, I have an interest in how we can use training and nutrition to improve athletic performance. On top of that, of course, we have people that will try and use alternative methods to try and enhance performance. Some of those have been those strategies have been assisted by pharmacologists and biochemists. And then the technology side is really interesting in terms of what's happening with, for example, track and field athletics, the use of new materials to improve running shoes seems to have had quite a large effect in the last 2 years in terms of running performance. So what I want to really do is to think, well, how long have people been trying to use different strategies to improve athletic performance? And you probably won't be surprised to hear that even in the ancient Olympic Games, athletes were taking all sorts of supplements to try and improve athletic performance. If we then move forwards to around about the mid-1800s, where we had the great pedestrianism. So this is people performing fantastic feats of endurance events. What we find is that not only did they have some what you might call rather questionable dietary practices, but they would quite often use various stimulants to try and get them through these events. And those stimulants would come in the form of strychnine. We also had people utilizing cocaine, normally in the form of cocoa leaves, caffeine, and also people taking opioids in the form of opium to try and improve athletic performance. If we then go forward to the 1904 Olympics, Thomas Hicks in the marathon was known to use a cocktail of strychnine and brandy to get himself through the marathon. And what we know is that taking things like strychnine, which is a poison, doesn't come without its risks. And unfortunately, we do have some examples of athletes that have used stimulants and unfortunately died from it. In 1960, we had Nudjedson, who was doing the 100-kilometer time trial at the Olympics, and unfortunately he died. And then 7 years later, the cyclist Tommy Simpson, known to have taken amphetamines as well as some alcohol, died while competing in the Tour de France. Now, whether or not somebody like Tom Simpson died because he'd been taking amphetamines as a stimulant or because of the environment, it was an extremely hot day, we don't know, but we do know that he was taking some form of stimulants. What about other notable drug takers in the past? Well, we have the 1988 Olympics. Ben Johnson won the 100 meters, only to test positive for stanozolol after the race. In 1998, we had what was called the Festina affair. So that was in the Tour de France, where an entire team was taken out to the Tour de France, found to have all sorts of paraphernalia for blood doping. And then we move forward to probably one of the most high-profile individuals known to have used performance-enhancing drugs, and that was Lance Armstrong, who in 2012, after many years of denying that he'd ever done any sort of doping, then finally admitted that he'd taken a range of drugs to try and enhance performance. And one of the reasons he gave was, well, because everybody else is doing it. If I didn't take the drugs, I wouldn't be able to compete with all the rest. And we have now really tried to clean up sport. And from there, we're then thinking about, well, how long have we been trying to do doping control? Is it a modern phenomenon, or is it something that goes back many years? And it wasn't until 1928 that the IAAF finally brought in a ban on doping during sport. It then took almost another 40 years before we had FIFA, which is the governing body for football, and the UCI, which is the governing body for cycling, to introduce testing. So we said that you can't take drugs to enhance performance, but it took another 40 years almost before we then introduced some form of testing to see whether or not people were taking drugs. In 1967, the IOC produced the first ever list of substances that appear now on the banned substance list, produced now by WADA. In the 1972 Olympics, we had the first systematic testing, that was in the Munich Olympics, of all athletes. If we then move forwards, so during the 1970s, we had state-sponsored doping, and it appears that it was mainly using anabolic steroids by the East Germans. And in 1976, anabolic steroids were added to the banned list. Then in the 1980s, we introduced a thing called the Therapeutic Use Exemption. So, for example, if you're an asthmatic and you have to take an anti-asthmatic drug, in some instances, that drug can appear on the banned list. So what the IOC and WADA did was that they said, well, obviously, as a medical exemption, those athletes can take those drugs, otherwise it'll exacerbate their underlying condition. So we do have athletes that use what's called a therapeutic use exemption. Over time, what we seem to have seen more recently is, well, how far can I stretch the rules? So if you're going to write up a therapeutic use exemption, and I know that it's got some form of performance enhancement, some athletes will then try and use that to try and get that edge. You'll be surprised to hear, or maybe not, that it wasn't until 1985 that blood doping was prohibited. So prior to the mid-1980s, in fact, back in the 1970s, there was some suspicion that some of our Scandinavian endurance athletes were blood doping. And usually what that entails is that, let's say that I'm focusing on the Tokyo Olympics that starts in just over a week's time, and I can still blood dope. So what I would do is around about January time, I would get my medical practitioner to come along and take off anywhere between 500 to a litre of blood. Obviously not all in one go, but I might do it in 2 or 3 stages, and then I would store that blood. Then as we come to the Olympics, what I would now do is reinfuse that blood, and what will happen is that my red cell count will increase, and therefore I'll have an increase in the oxygen carrying capacity of my blood, and as a consequence I should be able to increase my performance. So it wasn't until the 1980s, mid-1980s, that blood doping was banned. A decade later, in the mid-1990s, blood testing was introduced. And then 5 years after that, we then established the World Anti-Doping Authority. So now we've got an umbrella organization that organizes national testing centers, that they're all working to the same standard to test athletes, and also that all the tests are validated, that they're all using the same standards. It wasn't until 2000 that erythropoietin, that the test for EPO was validated. Prior to that, athletes were taking this peptide hormone, but there was no way of being able to test apart from a rather simple test, which is that you take off a blood sample and you can put that blood sample into a centrifuge, which will spin round, and it'll separate out the blood into two primary constituents. One is the plasma and the other are the red cells, and then you can take a ratio of those two. And what the authorities would do is that they would give you a percentage, so they would give you a ratio. So let's say that the number that you had was 45 and the limit is 50, then you're well within that ratio. And of course, what would happen is that you then get athletes that would take something to increase the red cell number, but not take them over that limit. And of course, then you're not really stopping people from doping. All you're doing is getting them to tweak whatever it is that they're doing so that they stay within that legal limit. And then in 2000, we then developed a test which would then show whether or not somebody had been taking erythropoietin that was not produced within the body. Then we go to 2008, and that is where we introduced the biological passport. So what would normally happen over a season is that if you have an athlete that produces a blood sample, that there wouldn't be very much change in things like that ratio that I talked about, the hemoglobin, over an entire season. So now we have this passport which allows us to test somebody out of season and then track what that passport looks like as they go through a complete season, to see or to detect whether or not they're doing anything that is contravening the rules that are put forward within the sport. So a rather brief history of where we are in terms of the development of anti-doping measures. How much does it cost? Well, I've got a poster here. I'm hoping that you can see it. So at the moment, or this is in 2016, WADA spent around about £21 million on testing of athletes, and that isn't just in competition. There's a lot of out of competition testing now. So they spent £21 million. What does that go on? Well, we can see here that in 2016 they conducted 300,000 tests. 300,000 tests. About a tenth of that goes on developing this athlete biological passport. And at the bottom here, we've got what's called an AAF, which is an adverse analytical finding. It doesn't necessarily mean that the athlete has been caught doping, but what it means is that there's something come up on the test that is outside of the normal levels, and then a second test will be done. And we can see here that there's 4,800 of these adverse analytical findings that come from 300,000 tests. It's around about 1.5%, or a 1.5% strike rate in terms of finding a test that sits outside of the normal range. So you might ask yourself, well, why do athletes take drugs in the first place? And a good example would be, so we have Samo Farah, who his data is available out on the web, and between 2008 and 2011, I looked at his 10,000 meter personal best times, and over that 3-year period, he improved his personal best by just under a minute. So if you imagine that this is somebody who's training 7 days a week, quite often twice a day, he's doing somewhere in the region of 70 to 80 miles a week running. And the improvement he finds in his 10,000 meter time, so we're talking running here around about 27 minutes for 10,000 meters. I would struggle to do that on a bike. That improvement over that 3-year period is about 3.5%. That sounds about right. So you would, for an elite athlete to improve their performance anywhere between 1 to 2% per year is a substantial achievement. So here we've got somebody, he trains for 3 years and he gets an improvement in his performance of about 3.5%. At the 2017 World Championships, Mo Farah won that World Championships. The difference between winning gold and being third on the podium was less than a second, and that represented about 0.07% difference between the winner and the individual picking up the bronze medal. So if I come along to an athlete and I can say, if you take substance X, it's a vitamin, but I have to inject it, and it's going to improve your performance by 2%. The temptation to do that is enormous. And this is why we still have an underlying problem in terms of doping in sport. And if we think, well, surely we can detect people. If some of you have looked at today's newspaper, you'll see that one of the professional teams in the Tour de France last night were raided by the French police because there had been a report of some suspicion that there'd been some doping at this year's Tour de France. In the very early 1960s, France made it illegal to do doping in sport, and so if you get caught in France, the police then take that on, and you will, if you've been found guilty, you then go in, or you're suspected of being guilty, you do go in front of a judge, and you just need to read, if you get time, David Miller's autobiography, where he was caught doping. For some reason, had kept some vials of erythropoietin in his flat. A report had gone out that he was doing some doping. The police turned up and found all the paraphernalia. And the story that he gives is a real eye-opener. The concept of being arrested and put in a cell and not knowing what's going to happen to you because you've been caught doping in France should act as some deterrent, but obviously we don't know what these reports are. But certainly that Festina affair from the 1990s is certainly should act as a warning for those individuals. So we still have a major challenge going on. What we find is that athletes will try and get as much of an edge as possible. For some examples in sport, we then have the people that are supporting them are not doing are not supporting them in a way that you would consider ethical. And just recently we had the medical director, Richard Freeman, being struck off for supplying British Cycling with a gel that he couldn't account for, and tried to say that he bought that for one of the coaches. He's been struck off. He's appealing that. But what he has said is that he's now going to reveal just exactly what happened. It's a real shame because, of course, for a lot of these athletes, they're clean, they're training extremely hard, and it only takes one or two individuals that decide that they're not going to abide by the rules. And then we end up with a scenario where everybody is being tarred with the same brush. So it continues to be a problem. Trying to stay ahead of people that will go to any lengths, it is a challenge. One of the things that we are now, or is becoming more apparent, are rather than people failing drugs tests, is that people fall foul of the regulations. And one of the most common is that if you miss 3 tests, you then have a doping violation. And rather commonly, we are finding that athletes who are supposed to tell you that they're at such and such a place at such and such a time, and then you can just pitch up and do the test, that then they're not there. So the testers turn up to your house at 10 o'clock and you're not there. They'll wait around, usually for about an hour. And if you're still not there, they leave, but you've now got on your record 1 missed test. If you have 3 of those, then that's an anti-doping violation, and you then could quite easily end up with a 2-year suspension. The current Olympics, do we have any high-profile cases? Well, there's a 100-meter sprinter from America that's no longer going because she tested positive for cannabinoid. She had been recreationally taking some marijuana. Now, what we know is that marijuana isn't particularly performance enhancing, but there are 2 types of cannabinoid. One of them you can take that doesn't appear on the banned list. It's being used quite widely by athletes. But of course, the other, which is the psychotropic part of the drug, that does appear, and that's what she has tested positive. In terms of the public opinion on that individual, there's somewhat of an outrage going on about whether or not she should have been included in the team, or whether she quite rightly, according to the rules, has breached the rules. So we are also entering this area of a bit of an ethical dilemma in terms of doping in sport. If it's not enhancing performance, should it appear on the banned list? Well, the other side to this is obviously the athlete welfare. And again, that is why I mentioned right at the start about doping doesn't come without its risks. The examples I gave were rather extreme, but there is a need for care of the athlete. So I think that also has to be taken into consideration. Okay, so that's around about 20-25 minutes of me talking. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that have come up. So at this point, I'll just take a break, and we'll just see if Nicole has received any questions as I've gone through.
Thank you so much, Derek. That was so interesting. As you know, Chloe and I are quite obsessed with this topic now. So that was absolutely brilliant. As I said at the start, everyone, you can put your questions into the chat box at the side. And yeah, just anything you want to ask, please feel free, and we'll give you a minute or two to do that. But while we're waiting for people to ask questions, yeah, when we were speaking before, you told me some really interesting. I think it was actually in the first meeting that we had about this event, about the trainers. You know, we're talking about different trainers that athletes have access to. And I was wondering if you could just tell everyone a little bit about that, about what you were telling me, in the way people are disadvantaged.
Okay, so if we think about the major manufacturers of trainers, so we have Nike, we have Adidas, Asics, Puma. Of course, they want athletes to take their trainers because if I'm a high-profile athlete, then what I'll find is, so for example, if I'm Mo Farah and somebody says, here's X amount of money, then for a manufacturer, if I now win 2 gold medals, what I'm hoping is that these people that are doing a park run want my trainers. So interestingly, Nike set itself the challenge of getting an athlete to run the first sub 2-hour marathon, and Eliud Kipchoge did it. Now, if you looked at the scientific support that he got, it quite amazing. But one of the things that they looked at was shoe design. So back in the early 1990s, when I used to do a bit of running, the midsole was made out of this material called EVA. Over time, what happened with that midsole, so if you imagine a foam, over time that foam would compress, and you'd lose some of the cushioning that goes in. But of course, if you have a shoe that cushions, that is absorbing energy, and it's not being used for any useful work. So in the late 1990s, some manufacturers started looking at shoe design and said, oh, if we think of people like the Paralympians, if we look at their prosthesis, it's made out of carbon fiber. And what we know is that we can design it so that there's more energy returned through the prosthesis than there is through the unaffected limb. So they then started to look at putting carbon plates inside the shoe. Now, they weren't particularly successful because what they found is that there was only 1 or 2 athletes that could actually utilize that carbon plate. But over time, the shoe design now incorporates a carbon plate. They've changed from EVA to this substance called PEBBAX. Quite a mouthful, but the compression qualities of that midsole are completely different than EVA. And what we know is that you get a much better return of energy. So those shoes are called Vaporfly. When they first came out on the market, I think they were being sold for about in excess of £200 a pair. Now, for a serious athlete, £200 a pair, well, it's worth it. But it depends where you are. And of course, because everybody wanted the shoes, I'll buy a pair of shoes and then I'll put them on eBay and I'll get somebody to buy those for £300. So now I've got these shoes that appear to be really good and everybody wants them. But the manufacturers, of course, because you'll have a patent on that shoe design, they're now trying to catch up. So Nike have got this carbon plate. The IAAF set the thickness of the midsole as well, so it can't be deeper than 60 millimeters. So they have had some restrictions on the shoe design. But the IAAF president, Lord Coe, basically said, I'm not that worried. But if you look at what's happened this year, we have a large number of athletes that seem to be setting personal bests. And one of the questions that quite frequently comes up and says, well, what shoes were they wearing? So I think over time, we may well find that the restrictions on that shoe design become tighter, a little bit like the swimming suits that we saw at the start of the 2000s, and very much like bicycle design now. When you look at, for example, either the track racing or on the road, there's a limit in terms of what's the minimum weight that bike can have. And there are other things. Certainly on the track, they all use the same wheels. Nobody's allowed to go off and do their own different wheels. I see there's lots of comments coming up. So
yes, there are.
Yeah.
It's so interesting, and I think it will be interesting to see if they do end up being more strict about what's allowed and what's not allowed in that area. I think it's very interesting. So next question is talking about therapeutic use exemptions. Should asthmatics compete at the highest level in the first place? There seem to be an abnormally high number of asthmatics in cycling.
Great question. I'm trying to think now. It's about 4 or 5 years ago, I listened to a talk from a clinician. This was at a conference, biomedical conference, just before the Rio Olympics. And it turns out that actually we do have a higher number of individuals that are asthmatic that interestingly are elite athletes. And this talk really was about, well, so what's the trigger? And it turns out that one of the triggers is if you have a really high ventilation rate, under normal circumstances, when you breathe air in, all the air goes past quite a large surface area of mucous membrane. And what that will do, it essentially moisturizes the air. So the air that goes into your lung is saturated with water. But at a very high ventilation rate, you can get some drying of those airways. And as a consequence, if you keep doing that, that will then induce exercise-induced asthma. So when they do the testing to see if they're asthmatic, they come up borderline. So then what happens is they are then told that they are borderline asthmatic, and from there they could use a TUE for asthma. A real good example of just what can happen with extremely high ventilation rates is if you look at racehorses, quite often at the end of a race, you'll see a racehorse having a nosebleed. And the reason for that is that the air that's coming in such a high volume actually damages that mucous membrane. So, what we're not talking about people like myself, a recreational athlete. We're talking about people that have a really high ventilation rate. Somebody like Matthew Pinsent had one of the highest lung capacities that's ever been recorded. Of course, Matthew Pinsent, unlike me, who's 5'8", Matthew Pinsent is 6 foot something and weighs close to about 100 kilos. A really big guy, and as a consequence, got a really high lung capacity.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is, what are your thoughts of the Olympic swimmer Sun Yang, who had been found guilty and then had this overturned and then been found guilty again? Does this inconsistent approach lead to a lack of confidence in governing bodies?
Well, it undermines that original decision. And but we, to some degree, we have to have the court of arbitration as well. So you can have an athlete that tests positive for something, and it may be that it's through no fault of their own, and we have some contamination, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue for WADA, because the detection rates and the detection limits now are so fine that you only need a small amount of contamination. Let's say it's some sort of dietary supplement that I've bought from a company that also makes something else that would show up positive in a test. Well, in that instance, that if I'm not careful with my manufacturing, I end up with a batch of supplement that is now contaminated, and the athlete takes that because they're not going to test it, and then they test positive. So I think you have to have some form of arbitration. The problem that we have with that athlete, of course, is that the evidence was pretty robust. But for an athlete that, am I really going to spend 4 years being banned when the next 4 years could be the peak for me? Well, I'm going to try my best to try and overturn that. But that's what the court of arbitration is. And so therefore you've got to test the athletes. If they come back and it's positive, you've got the second test, and then you've got the national governing bodies that then sanction that athlete.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Thank you.
It is, yeah.
And on the same vein, next question is, and also, what are your thoughts of athletes continuing to compete when they failed drug tests more than once on multiple occasions?
That is really difficult. There's he's actually emeritus now, but and he's ex-Aberdeen alumni, Professor Clyde Williams, who I remember going listening to a talk, and what he said was that for some forms of doping, the changes that you see as a consequence of doping are so profound that even if you leave it for 2 or 3 years, those changes, to some degree, are not irreversible. So that athlete now has got that advantage that they wouldn't have normally. I think if you've already been found guilty and you've served your time, and then you come back and repeat the whole thing, then pretty much like here in the UK, it's a lifetime ban. Not all countries will enforce that, and we did have. I'm thinking whether or not it was a World Championship or the Olympic Games. I think it was the World Championship where Usain Bolt was up against Warren Gatlin, and Gatlin had tested positive and then came back after he'd served a ban, and everybody wanted Bolt to win, and he did. But you ask, should Gatlin actually be on the start line at all? It's a difficult one to answer. Thank you. It was the World Championships.
Just come in and just saved there.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. The next one is, I've always wondered if funding and financing is a big issue in this area, and could we not organise better funding? Would it be at all possible to set a ceiling to the amount of funding that is allowed in order to level the playing field? And could this be applied to individual athletes as well as teams?
Okay, so for a moment there, I thought the funding was about the anti-doping program. But I suddenly realised that we're talking about how much money you give to athletes. That's a difficult question. I don't know if any of you have watched Going for Gold on BBC. So this is a bit of the history of British Olympic sports, and the low point that we had in Atlanta in 1996, and the decision that we shouldn't really be in that position ever again, and how we then started to use the national lottery to fund athletes. If you win, certainly in America, if you were to win a gold medal at the Olympics, you're pretty much guaranteed to be a millionaire. Okay. How you use that money is all about, well, who's guiding that athlete, whether it's, you know, a wrestler, judo player, basketball player. The rewards for elite level sport are huge. But if I compare some sports to professional sport, so let's say I compare triathletes, okay, and triathletes can make a living out of being a professional triathlete, and I compare that with winning the Open this week, okay. So if I was ever good enough and I turned up at Royal St George's and 4 days of golf and I win, the prize money for winning that, just the prize money, is in excess of £1 million. And then, of course, what will happen is that if I win the Open, I then have manufacturers of golf equipment falling over themselves to sponsor me. You look at somebody like Tiger Woods, and over his career, Tiger Woods, what do you do with $100 million? So these guys are not playing for money, they're playing for the prestige. But in order to get them to that point, the amount of prize money that's gone in is astounding. It's the same with football. It's you know, we have players on close to £500,000 a week. Well, flippantly, it's only football. But the other side to it is that career could only last 5 years. So, you know, yes, the rewards are very high, but you have quite a short career. Whether or not they're over rewarded is a challenge. What I would prefer to see is, rather than what I prefer to see is that we get an equal balance in terms of the rewards for men and women. Why do women only earn, you know, less than 50% than men? If you look at, I was watching some of the cricket yesterday, the women's cricket. It was great. It just as entertaining as men. But why are they earning, you know, 20% of what the male players are earning? So you could readdress it and rebalance things, and I think that would be a really constructive way to do it. So yeah, it is a difficult one.
Yeah, definitely. Next one is there a difference between the effects of altitude training and blood doping?
Oh yeah, there's a huge difference. So if I go from here and let's say I go to some training camp in the Alps, and I go up to 10,000 meters and I try and train at 10,000 meters, what I find is that I can't train as hard. So what will happen is that I'll have some degree of detraining, even though I'm at altitude. And one of the strategies that athletes now do is that it's called, you live high and you train low. So I go somewhere where I can get a cable car from where we're staying down into a valley, and I'll do a training session, and then I go back up to where we're staying. And that is completely different than me giving somebody taking a unit of blood off, waiting for 3 months so that those red cells are remanufactured and in the circulation, and then me giving somebody that transfusion. There are some downsides to using blood doping. It's not without its risks, even if you're using your own. Okay, so by giving somebody a blood transfusion, what I'm doing is increasing the red cell number. So on a day like today, where it's really warm outside, if I'm doing some sort of endurance event, there's a chance that I'll become dehydrated. And if I've added more red cells than would be normal, if I increase that blood viscosity, I can then maybe form a clot, and that would be an issue. When back in the late 1990s, when we had professional cyclists taking erythropoietin, one of the things that they would do, so here they're elevating the red cell number, and they would set an alarm clock at night, or they would set an alarm that was attached to a heart rate monitor. If the heart rate dropped too low, it would set the alarm off. They'd get up and they'd have a bike or something in the room, and they'd get on the bike and do a bit of exercise to get the heart rate up. Because the red cell number was so high, there was a risk of them developing a clot in the circulation. So it, like I said, it's one of these things where it's a risk, this whole blood doping.
Very much so. Thank you very much. This is our last question in the chat. So if you guys have got anything else you want to ask, then please feel free to type it in now and we'll manage to get to it. The next question is, I've also wondered if there are higher instances of doping offences depending on the sport. I feel more aware of this in relation to athletics, cycling, swimming, and less so in gymnastics and tennis.
That's a great question. And it, to some degree, you might look at it and say, oh yeah, well, look at all these athletes that have been caught. But not all sports are tested to the same level. In fact, some sports don't even do any testing. So it's changed slightly now, but over in the States, professional baseball, it was, open season, do whatever you want. And so we had guys, Mark Maguire, who, if you looked at pictures over sort of a 3-year period, he went from looking quite a big guy to a man mountain. So, and of course, if you've not got any drug testing, then you're just not going to stop. What would be the thing that you might test for in gymnastics? Well, we had, like I said, we had state-sponsored doping over in the Eastern Bloc, and what they would do is they would give athletes drugs to prevent going into puberty. So again, that's an issue. I'm not saying that goes on now, but the different types of doping is quite specific to a lot of sports. Where you've got sports that are determined by weight, so some combat sports, one of the most common drugs there that are taken are diuretics. So what I do is I take a diuretic, I pee out loads, and then I get on the scale and I can make the weight. Of course, the other thing is that taking a diuretic is also used as a masking agent. So I've taken a drug and I want to flush it out of my system, I'll take a diuretic as well. So either way, things like diuretics could either be because I'm trying to make weight, or I'm trying to mask the fact that I've taken something else.
Thank you very much for that. The next question is, there was talk of gene doping 5 to 6 years ago. Has there been any examples of this actually being used by coaches and athletes?
This is really interesting because that whole issue about gene doping came up. It's around about 10 years ago, because we had big advances in understanding which genes control things like muscle mass size. but what we now understand is that actually trying to do gene therapy is really difficult. It's technologically extremely challenging. So trying to change somebody's gene profile is an issue. I think as we move forwards, some of the cellular signaling that goes on to determine muscle size are more likely to be targets from the pharmacology than actually trying to manipulate the genes.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is, do you think it's impossible to ensure a consistent approach to anti-doping is taken across various countries? Thinking of the scandal in Russia and then also countries where potentially the facilities are not of the same standard.
Well, we try our best. WADA does send teams around to check what the way that anti-doping is conducted in different countries. Unfortunately, we have some examples of athletes that will bribe the testing team. And then the other side to this is that we do have manipulation. So there have been examples where a testing team's gone along and supposedly taken a urine sample from the athlete, and it's one of the testing team that have provided the urine sample. So it's a really difficult one to control, and the number of tests is also that are run isn't standard across countries. That state-sponsored doping that went on in Russia was really sophisticated to the point whereby they got the equivalent of the KGB to work out when you've got your sample, you put it in a bottle and you put a lid on that's tamper-proof. So once you put the lid on, if you try and take it off, it damages the lid, and then you know that somebody's tampered with it. And they had the Secret Service work out how to take the lids off without damaging them. So what they did, and the way that they ran that whole that Winter Olympics, was that they had, where the testing lab was, they also had a hole in the wall with a room next door, and they would look at which athletes would be tested. So they already had a bank of samples that had been provided when all the athletes were clear. And what they would do is they'd look at the list. Oh, right, so Joe Bloggs had been tested. And then somebody would go in and pass the sample that they'd given at the Olympics through a hole in the wall. They'd then take the lid off using this new technology and put the clean sample in, and then put the lid back on and pass it back through. So that's how sophisticated and how determined they were to bypass the testing.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question says, a little bit off topic, but what's your view on Casta Samanaya and her, I hope I'm saying that right, and her not being allowed to run at her specialist event at the Olympics this year unless she had agreed to take medication to reduce her testosterone levels?
It's a very controversial area, because how does the IAAF work out how much of an effect that naturally produced testosterone is having in terms of her athletic performance? It's a really difficult one, because of course by giving her an increase in progesterone and estrogen, that doesn't just affect the neuromuscular system, it affects a whole range of different things. So it's a real challenge. I think the bigger issue I have with the Olympics as we go forwards is where we have transgender athletes that are competing against. So I'm a man, and I then decide that I'm going to reassign my gender into a woman, but biologically I'm still a man. So, and now I want to compete against women. I think that's a much bigger issue for the IOC than having women that have a naturally higher testosterone level than the majority of people that are competing against, and trying to pharmacologically manipulate that. I don't think that that's actually fair to that athlete, because there are a whole range of other things that will happen as a consequence of taking that approach with that athlete.
Thank you very much. The last is more a comment than a question. The last comment we got is, in Russia and various other countries, medal winning is a national honour, no matter how it is achieved. So as long as politics are involved, we need independent, neutral controllers, and those will not be welcomed by those countries.
Well, there is an awful lot of store put on the Olympics. You know, it's thought of as the pinnacle of athletic achievement, and you know, as an athlete, whether that is track and field or swimming or gymnastics, that if your sport is in the Olympics, that is the thing that you want to win at. And so there's an awful lot of store that's put on it. One would hope that the Olympics, the focus of the Olympics would change with time. It's about bringing nations together rather than simply about winning medals. I was fortunate enough to go to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, and I have to say the atmosphere was fantastic. Yeah, you want to see your home athletes doing really well, but the whole approach was something about coming together and just enjoying people that could do things, whether that was in a swimming pool or in a gymnasium, really well, and thinking, I wish I could do that, and just celebrating these athletes. I think you're correct in terms of there are probably too much politics in it, but then again, it's difficult because there's an awful lot at stake.
Exactly, and Chloe just said, I guess as well, for certain countries and sports, the outcome of the Olympics also impacts the funding available to them.
It does, and then you've got other countries that, and I'm thinking about East African countries that have this whole tradition about doing well in endurance sports. So you think about countries like Ethiopia and Kenya and endurance running, and that is their main thing, you know. So for a lot of these individuals, it is a real way to make a lifetime contribution. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that's it for questions, unless anyone's got a last minute burning thing they need to ask. You've got another minute. You can put it in the chat if you like. But if not, then it's just left for me to say thank you so much, Derek, for lending us your time this afternoon, especially in the glorious sunshine outside, to come inside and do this for us. That was wonderful. It was so interesting, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it just as much as we did.
Well, thanks for the people that made it. I hope you found it entertaining, and who knows, I might do something similar again in the future.
Yes, please.
That'd be good.
Yes, please. Thank you so much, and to everyone, thank you for coming and joining us today. Like I said, we hope you enjoyed it, and we'll maybe see you at another event soon. So thank you, and have a nice rest of your day.